you're waiting for a bus, Ellie. You know, the 10-minute minute.
In the winter, you could catch pneumonia waiting for a bus, but then that's another story.
Not indeed, yeah. Under current circumstances, pneumonia would probably be a better option. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee on Friday, the 11th of December. Before we start, I've just got a short statement to read out regarding the conduct of the meeting. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the Council holds this meeting electronically in accordance with the appropriate and relevant regulations. Members of the public may also attend in an electronic capacity, and there's a link on the Council's website for them to do so. Members of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee are asked to keep their microphones switched off until called to speak, and again switch their microphones off once they have finished speaking. Cameras may be left on throughout the meeting if members so wish. However, if you experience connection or other technical issues, it may be helpful and appropriate to switch your camera off. Cameras should be switched on if and when speaking in the course of the meeting. To indicate a wish to speak, members should use the raise hand function. Use of the chat function is preserved exclusively for voting. At the end of the debate on each item of business, there'll be a vote. Members should vote using the meeting chat function by indicating for, against, or abstain, and I will declare the result after each vote. I intend that there should be breaks of 5 minutes every hour, and these will be taken so as to avoid interrupting the flow. These will be taken after a speaker in the debate is finished. If we're voting, the vote will be concluded before the break is taken. Other breaks will be incorporated as appropriate. So thank you for that. Changes to membership. Sandy Walkington sends his apologies, and Ron Tyndale has very kindly stepped up. Thank you very much, Ron. Good morning to you.
Good morning, David.
And we've received apologies from Roma. So let's those formalities out the way. Could I ask any members that have an interest to declare them, please? Absolute silence. That's good. OK, thank you. I'm assuming at this stage there aren't any. Should any interests arise during the meeting, just please attract my attention and we'll deal with it as we can. The minutes of the committee meeting held on the 9th of October. Would you join with me in approving those if you're content? The vote will now come up in the chat.
Sorry, David, could I come in?
Yes, please. Hello, Nigel.
Yeah, a couple of things, I'm afraid. Firstly, you will recall that we had quite a long conversation about the process of reviewing the recommendations from last year's IP.
Yeah.
Wasn't referenced in the minutes at all.
Well, the minutes are not, as you know, the minutes are not a verbatim. They're
No,
dealing
I thought it was quite an important point, and we'll be raising it again in terms of looking forward to this year's IP. As we just discussed. So I do think that ought to have been taken note of and recorded in the minutes. And a small point, but I think an important point of clarification in 2.9, the discussion on visiting residents in care homes. It wasn't just about dementia, it was also about generally. And I think we ought to record the fact that the adult care have done, and public health have done what they can to make a very, very difficult situation as good as possibly can be. But it wasn't just dementia sufferers that were of a concern. It's everybody who's been in a care home and been unable to meet relatives.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I wouldn't be unhappy to see something to that effect. Debbie, I'm concerned about Nigel's first point, though. Are you in a position to advise or comment?
The thing with the minutes, they are all recorded. They aren't verbatim. Everyone can go online and review what was said. They are very long, but I can go on and look at them again. But it's everybody's view.
OK, well, would you do that and then come back to me, and I will liaise with Nigel as to the outcome from the conclusions that you produce, and then
if I may, David, sorry, but I mean 1.1, all it needs is an extra phrase in there to say not just that they were confirmed as correct, but that there was discussion about how those recommendations would be acted upon, and the relevant part of the conversation is that, as Debbie has in other parts of the minutes.
Okay. My first comment remains, though. Let Debbie look at that. She'll go back to the record,
Okay.
and then you and I can discuss it. And if the committee is satisfied to delegate that to me, otherwise I'll bring it back to the committee for the next meeting.
I'm sure you're capable, David, of sorting that out. Thank you.
Are the committee happy to agree the minutes on that basis? Are we going to put a vote up, Ellie? Here we go. Yes, thank you. That looks to me that we have unanimity there. Are Democratic Services content? Would appear not at this stage. Okay, thank you very much. Right, minutes agreed as discussed. That's superb. Thank you very much. Now, we move on then to item 2, education and COVID impacts with local, regional and national position. And I'm very, very pleased to say we have 3 excellent contributions coming forward here. And the first is from Kim Pigram. I hope I've got that right, Kim. A senior Ofsted inspector who's got 10 minutes. Thank you. No pressure. You don't get a bong, but 10 minutes, please, to give us a national oversight. Kim, the floor is
Brilliant
yours.
stuff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a presentation with you, which I think was shared with you last night, but I'm going to turn my camera off just because it helps connectivity. So just bear with me 30 seconds. Yep. And if you could tell me when you can see that, that would be really useful.
Yes, that's fine. That's come through fine. Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Okay, so my name is Kim Pigram. Yes, you got it spot on. I've been called a lot of things, some politer than others, but Pigram is exactly the way to go. 2 barnyard animals put together. I'm a senior Her Majesty's Inspector in the East of England. There are 4 of us, and I am what we call the senior HMI link for Hertfordshire. So I liaise with Hertfordshire regarding education, broadly speaking. The first thing that I'm going to try and do quickly this morning is give you a very quick overview about the period March to August 2020 in the work of Ofsted, particularly focusing on schools, but with a little bit more of an overview, and then move into the work that we've been doing in the autumn period of 2020. And then, as much as I possibly can, because things are still being ironed out, talk to you about what spring will look like. And I'm going to try and keep bringing it back to Hertfordshire as much as I can, but I won't be doing that as well as other speakers today. So you should see a different screen now. Can I just check that you're seeing something saying temporary suspension of inspections?
We are.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so on the 17th of March 2020, all routine inspections of schools, further education and skills, which we call FES, early years, local area SEND inspections and social care were suspended due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I'll talk to you a little bit later, if I get time, about what routine inspection actually is to us, because some of you, I would imagine, will be very au fait with what routine inspection is, and some of you may not be. So I will go through that a bit later. But effectively, we suspended routine inspection owing to the pandemic between that period of March to August 2020. We still undertook some emergency style inspections, urgent inspections, and they're carried out under something called an NFD, a no formal designation, and that's where we have any serious concerns that come to us that we must go out. And so we undertook a very, very small number of those during this period. I think it was no more than 2 or 3 nationally. We also conducted around 70 inspections of independent schools. Now, Ofsted and independent schools are not necessarily always commonly known as being put into the same sentence, but Ofsted are commissioned by the DfE to inspect independent schools, and so we inspected 70 independent schools, I think, during the period up and down the country, and most of these inspections were pre-registration. Schools that want to open, so we go and check out whether they are likely to meet standards and be able to open safely for young people. And also something called material change inspections, which is where schools may be registered to take, for example, a certain number of children or a certain age range of children, and they wish to extend that. So we undertook some of those inspections. Social care undertook around 300 monitoring visits, and 30 of those kind of on-site visits were between March and May of 2020. And there were also a number of on-site visits for early years and childcare providers. So, the regulatory work in children's social care in early years continued throughout lockdown, even though regular inspections were suspended. And that's because it was really important to maintain that social care provision and oversight for really vulnerable children, and those registration requirements for children in the early years. So that's just a kind of brief overview about Ofsted generally, and I'm going to talk more specifically in this session about schools. So in autumn 2020, and this presentation talks in the present tense, but actually we are on the last week of this work. So in some respects, I'm almost talking past tense as well. So we announced our plans that in the autumn, routine inspection for schools was going to remain suspended, but that we were going to undertake a programme of visits to education and social care providers, but particularly visits to have a look at how schools were getting back to some form of curriculum and some form of running and safeguarding during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the reason that we continue to suspend routine inspections is that we recognise that we were in exceptional circumstances, as we still are in many ways, and this was part of a kind of proposed phased return to inspection. So this was almost like phase 1, these interim visits. And there's lots of information. There's a published operational note out there if you want any more particular detail around the visits. But I think that the most important thing to say around this is that the purpose of these visits very much was about oversight, support and assurance. And it was also about very much working with leaders of schools to talk to them and gather their views and their opinions about what was happening for them. So the interim visits that we undertook over the autumn period usually lasted for 1 day. And they started, we had some pilot visits in the week beginning, I think the 14th of September, to test how we would do these things and how we would undertake these conversations. But the actual visits started from the 28th of September. They lasted for 1 day, and there is not, again, an operational note. If you go on the gov.uk website and you type in operational note interim visits, you'll be able to find some of the details that we put out to the public at that point in September. The most important thing, and if you know anything about schools inspection, is that these were not inspections. They were under Section 8 because that's our legislative powers to be able to go to schools, but they were not inspections. They did not use our school inspection handbook, and they did not use the education inspection framework, which again, I don't want to get tied up in different terminology, but it didn't use anything that we would normally use for routine inspection. The only other inspections that I did mention earlier that we continue to have carried out in autumn is our no formal designation, our Nfd Section 8 inspections. And that they're used when we are really responding to significant concerns, either around safeguarding or a breakdown in leadership and management. So there were very few of those because they are the most urgently concerning inspections, but we did undertake a few of those during this period as well. So in terms of the interim visits, we visited, and I can't tell you the exact numbers because we finished them up this week, but I think we visited approximately 1,200 schools. We've gone to a range of graded schools. So as you may be aware, obviously grade 1 is outstanding, grade 2 is good, grade 3 requires improvement, and grade 4 is inadequate. So we have gone to all schools that were previously judged in their inspection as inadequate, and then a sample of grade 1, grade 2 and grade 3 schools. We've given the schools up to a day's notice. So we ring about 10 o'clock the previous day. At the end of each of these visits, we publish a very, very short letter. Now you'll see them if you know of schools, and I think there were, I want to say, about 30 odd schools in Hertfordshire that received an interim visit during the autumn period, and each of those will have a short letter published afterwards that is factual. It simply talks about 5 or 6 key things that were discussed, about what leaders are doing in order to try and overcome the barriers that they're facing linked to COVID-19. Now, what we were not doing and what we are not doing as we finish up this week is making any judgment about schools' response to COVID-19 during the spring and summer terms. We understand that was an exceptional time. The HMCI was very clear throughout that period that we would not be going back and evaluating how well leaders coped during the first lockdown, because that would not be fair. We didn't also this has been quite hard for inspectors because it's very different to our normal work. We did not provide any school level evaluation or graded judgments. So we literally just talked to leaders and we listened to what leaders had to say to us. The focus, which I think is probably quite useful to know, particularly for the 30 odd schools that we came to in Hertfordshire, or have been to in Hertfordshire, the focus was around these kind of 5 key things. So the first one was around the barriers that the school faced, and actually, let's be quite honest, still may be facing at this current time in managing the return of all pupils to their full education. And we know nationally that actually there are some children that still have not returned to for some of them any education at all, but many to full education. We also looked at how leaders were ensuring that pupils were getting back to the school's curriculum after such a period of disruption. So it's one thing to have your children coming back onto site. It's quite another to then work out what have they missed from the time that they haven't been having formal education as such on a school site, and how do you bridge those gaps? So there's some of the conversations we were having with leaders and have been having with leaders. We also wanted to talk to leaders and gather their views about how they feel their pupils were settling back into routines and behaviours. And that there's been some quite interesting kind of conversations that we've had out of that with the 1,200 schools. We also talked very clearly about how if there's any very specific issues related to children who have special educational needs and disabilities or specific emotional and mental health needs, and how they're addressing those, and how well or how difficult it's been for leaders to get access to the external services that they might need for these young people during this time. And we did also discuss with leaders in each of those schools the safeguarding arrangements, but not safeguarding in the traditional sense that we would do it under inspection format, but very much about actually what new challenges were being brought to them? Were they finding any particular barriers to accessing external agencies? And sometimes things that were working really well for them. So they were the focus of the interim visits. Now, and I need to keep coming back to these visits during this autumn period are not inspections, and we don't triangulate. Well, unlike normal inspection types, we don't triangulate this information. It purely is about a professional dialogue between leaders and inspectors. So we make no judgments on the effectiveness of schools during these visits, and we are not judging leadership and management. But we do focus very much around, and particularly around the safeguarding, around actually how are they identifying pupils who may need early help, particularly young people that may have not been vulnerable prior to the lockdown, but actually were now vulnerable or had now been identified as vulnerable, and how they were securing that help that pupils and young people needed, and how they were also managing safer recruitment, because recruitment during the COVID period adds great, recruitment is complex anyway, as most people will know, but recruitment during the COVID period was particularly complex. So, and again, this was odd for inspectors as it was for schools, and I'm not sure schools truly believe that this is what we were going to be doing at the beginning. I think they believe us now after we've undertaken all these visits, but we did no planning for these visits. Because they're not inspections. We didn't ask schools for any documents or any data. We didn't move around the school. We didn't go and look at the school for obvious reasons. We didn't ask them to prepare any lesson plans. We didn't look at any work. We didn't undertake lesson visits. We didn't review schools' policies. And we didn't actually talk to all stakeholders. So, for example, we weren't necessarily talking to chief executives of multi-academy trusts that may be running schools, because we wanted to talk to the people that were running the school on a daily basis and find out about the issues that they were facing. And then after the visit, as I've already said, there is a short letter that gives parents information that inspectors were given. But equally, there's also a factual accuracy check that then, we come away from the visit, we write the letter, we send it to the school, and the school get a chance to as we do during inspection, actually, they get a chance to check the factual accuracy of what we've written. But actually, although individual schools are interesting, you could almost see this as it's a piece of research work, because what the unit of interest is to look at those 1,000 odd schools, and collectively, what does that tell us about the picture for schools across England, in terms of how they're getting back to some form of education with children in very difficult circumstances. And then what we've done is on a kind of monthly basis. So there's been 2 so far, and there should be a 3rd, I think. We've published briefings. So we've collated the information that we've got from that block of schools up and down the country, and we've collated the information into this briefing. So, one for October, one for November. And some of the main findings that I thought you may find interesting, and again, if you want more information, I can forward you on the briefing if you want to read it in detail. But the main findings at the moment is that there's real variability in terms of the extent to which pupils have returned to school. We do know that, generally speaking, schools are saying that attendance is comparable to where they were previously, but there are groups of pupils isolated, and we also know that the coding, there's been amendments to how schools can code young people when they're isolating. So, it's very difficult to tell actually how much of that is making, and I would imagine making quite a significant difference to some of that attendance. Schools out there are adapting their curriculum based on practical considerations. So Anecdotally, it's very difficult now. I remember going to a specialist provision who spent a lot of their time in the community. A lot of the work that they did around the ASDAN qualification, they took their young people out to the community to work in local cafes. They found that was far too challenging given the difficulties around COVID and actually the closure of a number of businesses. And so therefore they had to adapt their curriculum very quickly. That's one example. There are thousands of examples of what people have had to do, but also how they've had to adapt curriculum because children have missed such a chunk of formal learning. We
Kim,
also
can I just interject there because
am I running over
fascinating,
time?
But I am conscious that we've still got quite a few slides to go. So if you could begin to just
of course I can.
Let's go through.
No problem at all.
And I think as well, if towards the end, I think members would be very interested to hear what your plans are for the next term. But I'll leave that with you.
No, that's absolutely fine. So we can do that. So effectively, we know that leaders are ambitious to return to the curriculum as soon as possible. We know that there are challenges to keeping schools open safely. And we know that there are some real elements around poorer physical and mental health of children after periods of lockdown. Well, now 2 lockdowns actually, but for children and young people. So I'm just going to spend literally 1 minute because I'm very mindful of time. I do apologise for overrunning. Where we are going now. So the interim visits come to an end literally this week. We have published another operational note. I think we published it 3 days ago to say that we will not be returning to a full range of inspections. And again, I haven't got time to, and I'll happily go through it with people another time, but we're not going to be returning to a full range of Section 5 inspections where we grade schools, but we will be returning to the monitoring inspections in the spring term of schools that are currently inadequate, of schools that are currently requires improvement and have been for a number of inspections, and also some other schools that have been judged to be requires improvement. And the focus around that is ensuring that they are judgments in the respect that we make a decision about whether schools are taking effective action or not taking effective action to get out of inadequate or get out of requires improvement. But they are also supportive conversations about to support leaders in their thinking about how they're trying to address not only the COVID situation that they're dealing with, but also school improvement. I'm going to stop there because actually I have no doubt I've overrun massively. Yes, I think that's probably me done.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I found that fascinating, and I do hope you can stay with us because we will be taking questions at the end, if that's okay. So we'll go through all the presentations and then have a combined question at the end. Thank you so much for that.
No problem at all. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Bear with me a second.
Excellent, good. I've got Nigel and Ron. Your questions are noted, but as I say, we'll come back to you after the conclusion of the presentations. Next we have Dame Kath Dethridge, Regional Schools Commissioner. Good morning. Good morning, Kate. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. I haven't got slides to share with you. I'm just going to talk to you, if that's all right. So first off, I just want to say a huge thank you for inviting me to this session this morning, but also I want to take the opportunity to thank your officers who have worked so collaboratively with us during the last 10 months, and we have really, really appreciated that. If I can start by saying just a little bit about my role and the role of the RSC. In usual times, obviously, we oversee the work of and development of strong trusts and all trusts and single academies. We encourage the development of our stronger trusts and intervene if we have concerns about performance. That might be academic or financial or on matters of governance. And in this, we work hand in hand with the ESFA, the Education Skills Funding Agency. We become involved when a maintained school is judged inadequate. We offer support to schools that have been judged RI by Ofsted, and we also have oversight of pupil place planning, the development and delivery of free schools, and we take decisions on significant changes to academies and free schools. prior to the COVID crisis, we spent a great deal of time getting to know and hearing from our academies and trusts, and we would have business meetings with them. And so if I can give you a context, last year we had, as a team, we had around about 200 business meetings with our trusts or academies. And obviously, given the current crisis, we have suspended those. We completely understand the pressure and that the school leaders and heads are under, and the requirement to focus on supporting their schools during this crisis. So for the time being, we are not having business meetings in the way we have in the past, but we do intend, obviously, to pick those up again once things become more manageable. More recently, all RSCs have also picked up some policy portfolios, and that means that we work much more closely with our policy colleagues to ensure that the policy that's being shaped is deliverable. And so one of the advantages, of course, that we have is that we speak so much to our local authorities, to schools, to heads, to trust leaders, and we've got an enormous amount of information and reflections from people who are doing the job all the time that we can share with those who are shaping policy, so that we can ensure that whatever the policy is becomes more deliverable. And certainly for me, my policy areas are early years, governance and leadership. So over the last 10 months since the crisis has hit, RSCs have also been involved in leading the coordination of the department's response through running what we call REACT meetings. There was an article about them actually in Schools Week last Friday. If you're interested, tell you more detail about what a REACT meeting is. But it's what REACT stands for is Regional Education and Children's Teams, and they consist of RSCs who chair the meetings, and then colleagues from our Special Educational Needs and Disabilities team, from Children's Social Care, from Early Years and FE, and again from the ESFA. And we get together now monthly, but prior to that, when the crisis first struck, it was at least weekly, sometimes twice a week. And we get together in order to coordinate our engagement with, in particular, local authorities, but also to share information so that we can get a really full picture of the challenges that local authorities have been facing, and where possible, where we can offer support and help. We were certainly made aware and have tried to be really sensitive to the fact that if we didn't coordinate this as local authorities, you might be having, a conversation with SEND, a conversation with Early Years, a conversation with us, which is not a great use of your time, particularly if we're all asking the same questions. So the idea really was to try and coordinate, as I say, coordinate our response. Our regular conversations with local authorities and with, of course, with your officers has been absolutely invaluable in terms of understanding and responding to the challenges that schools and academies face. To begin with, while there was no inspection and there were no assurance visits, Ofsted were part of this group, and a number of HMI, as I'm sure Kim, I don't know if Kim was involved, but a number of HMI offered their services to local authorities that were in need of some additional resource, and that was really well received. In terms of addressing inequalities of the sort of the learning experience for children, you'll know that the department has invested, I think it's over 195 million to support remote education, and that's through laptops and tablets, through internet provision and online learning platforms as well. And we've also announced £1 billion COVID catch-up plan to deliver tutoring and also to deliver free catch-up programmes such as the reception year Nuffield early language intervention. And of course, there's also the package of measures to make the 2021 assessments and exams as fair as possible. Obviously, the important priority for us, as for you, over these last 10 months has been keeping children in school, having their face-to-face lessons. And again, I'd like to really thank your officers for working so well with us with such a strong partnership to ensure that this has happened. Hertfordshire school leaders and teachers really have done a great job in keeping all children in school where possible, and we're really grateful for that. I also have spent a fair bit of time over the last 10 months, again, as I say, trying to listen to as many heads and school leaders and trust leaders as I possibly can. So I've been running a set of heads roundtables for both primary and secondary. I think I've got one on Monday and another one next Thursday, I think. And again, that is, I hope, their opportunity to speak to me and to get their voice and opinions heard within the department. And I must say, the department is very keen to hear that. Regarding next term, of course, we've all, and my view is, we've all really focused on let's get ourselves through to Christmas. But of course, then already we need to be, thinking about January and what that will bring. And one of the things that we do consider a lot and think about is that the stamina that our school leaders will require, come January, and just hoping that they do manage to get a break over Christmas. And, as I say, moving forward, we will continue to listen to our leaders, listen to our local authorities, work collaboratively and very positively as we do with you, in order to, secure the best experience we possibly can for the children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kath. Much appreciated. Again, if you'd be kind enough, if we could persuade you to stay behind with us for a little bit longer for some questions at the end of the. Thank you very much. So I call now to Simon Newland. Simon, are you with us?
Yes, thanks, David.
Good morning, Simon. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I think I'm just going to speak as well. I haven't got slides or a presentation. And I did want to start actually by, I suppose, doing the same as Kate has done, which is to thank colleagues within the RSC's office for all the work that they've done with us over the last, well, eternity, it feels like, but 9 months certainly. And I do think one of the positives of the COVID crisis is the way in which our relationships have strengthened and developed over the period as we've worked together to try to address that. And of course, our dialogue with Ofsted continues. So thanks very much to you, and in particular to Joe Farrell, who's one of the lead officers there. I'm not going to talk about everything that's going on in county, not least because we had a webinar about 2 or 3 months ago where I talked about quite a lot of that. So I'll just pick up some things that are current and things that are new. So at the beginning of this week, the proportion of our children who were in school was around 91% in primary, 84 in secondary, and 89 in special. And that figure has been dropping since the September-October period, when it remains above the national average. But of course, the national average is heavily influenced by the way the outbreak has happened. But things have clearly deteriorated for us in the last 6 weeks. And I think Kim's COVID briefing is looking back to the kind of October period. And I think now early December is more challenging. So we've found that in the last 2 weeks, we have 11 of our secondary schools, of our 80 secondary schools, with 30 or more cases. Every secondary school has had a case at least. 20 of those, five more secondaries with 20 plus cases. So some of our secondary schools are being very heavily impacted, more so than our primary schools. We have in aggregate over 10,000 pupils out self-isolating. But then within that, there are 1 or 2 schools who've barely been touched. So it's a very differential experience within the school's community. What we do know from our overall infection management and control activities, that's the corporate activities, that the infection rates amongst 12 to 16-year-olds are rising at the moment very rapidly. And I think, therefore, the scene is set for a very challenging spring that might even be more challenging than the late part of this term. And that means that schools continue to be heavily focused on operational management and the multiple challenges that go with that, including the mental health and well-being of staff and teachers and pupils, as well as, of course, the sort of dominant thing for us, which is the safety of pupils. I talked about the support at the last webinar, about the kind of support that we'd wrap around schools, and that continues to extend, for example, in relation to mental health and well-being advice to help schools help their pupils. I talked to you last time about our Back on Track programme for primary schools developed by Hearts for Learning. That has been rolled out, and around 640 packages have either been bought or provided to primary schools, and those cover a range of areas: assessment, early years, English, maths, science, and they're intended to help schools deal with some of the challenges that Kim referred to, the kind of catching up, the assessment of where pupils are and the catching up. And those packages are both resources and a structure for approaching the challenges, but also training and consultancy. So that's what's going on at the moment to help schools in the middle of this operational crisis. I mean, we are now looking, well, we're looking at the spring term with some dread, but we're looking into the more distant future about how we try to move from kind of crisis mode more firmly into recovery and then eventually back to something approaching normal. And we're beginning to identify, we will identify 6 areas for action, which will be the kind of pillars of our recovery planning. And one of those is leaders' well-being. I don't think I need to say more about that. We know that that's a big issue. Another one is closing staff skills gaps. And we're aware, as I'm sure Kim and Kate are, that newly qualified teachers over this last year and over the coming year will have a very different experience to that which is normally the case. So there's some work to do there. There's closing pupils' knowledge and skills gaps, and that's what the Back on Track programme is about. I think that's a continuing major challenge. There will be the preparation for 2021 assessment and years beyond that, and changes which are planned for the early years foundation stage assessment process. And there is what I think will be pretty difficult, which is helping schools to deal with the financial issues that have arisen as a result of COVID, and thriving, we're going to call it thriving despite financial challenges. So it's a programme of action working with schools to to help them deal with the financial consequences of COVID and the financial planning for the future. And I think probably lastly, trying to develop our thinking on a new and wider vision for the future. I mean, one thing that we're also thinking about at the moment is the impact of all this on our relationship with schools. And of course, we have a different type of relationship with maintained schools to that we have with academies. But one thing that will be the case for the next, I think probably 2 years, is that we will be working with our schools without the kind of scaffolding of data, of outcome data and progress data and all the other data that we normally operate with. And that's because the experience of different schools in the pandemic has been so varied, and the experience of different pupils within the pandemic has been so varied, that it won't be straightforward to rely on attainment data to judge pupil and institutional progress, and indeed the local authority as a whole. It won't be as easy to do that as has been in the case in the past. And whilst our interaction with our schools and our maintained schools in particular has always been based on a strong level of what Kim's described as a professional dialogue, as articulated in the Ofsted visits in the autumn, but professional dialogues undertaken by our Hertfordshire improvement partners. That kind of dialogue is going to be even more front and centre of stage in the way that we work with our schools to help them to improve, and the way that we identify, we monitor what they're doing, we challenge them, we support them, and insofar as we need to intervene, it provides us with the a position, if you like, to intervene. But that dialogue and that on-the-ground knowledge is going to become even more important vis-a-vis the data, because the data will be for several years pretty shaky. So fine, I think that probably wraps up my contribution, and I think, David, it may be question time.
Indeed, Simon, thank you so much. Fascinating to hear that perspective. No, very, very useful. Give everybody a chance just to have a quick breath, catch their thoughts. But as we go into that, Nigel was first out of the trap quite early on. So Nigel, could you pose your question? Could you tell us first of all who you're putting the question to?
Thank you, David. I actually think I jumped the queue by leaving a legacy hand up, but that's fine.
Oh well, okay.
No, I did have questions.
You haven't. You've left your towel on the sun lounger. Yeah.
Yes. I think my questions are for all three speakers, actually. I think, just as a precursor, I listened to the Independent Sage on education a couple of weeks back, who were raising red flags all over the place about where we were at. And I think if we go back to our discussions back in the joint scrutiny in July, I and others were raising concerns about the plans for the autumn because they didn't seem to be ready for a second wave in education. And we're now, I'm glad to hear Simon using the word dread for the spring term, because I think some realism is really overdue on the challenges facing schools thanks to COVID. My question really is, what assumptions are now being made about the degree of disruption that we're going to see through the rest of the school year? What is the attitude to assessment? Should we, as I would suggest, follow very quickly the example from Wales, and I think now Scotland cancelled their exams? And are we considering breaking up early for Christmas, as Wales has just announced? This was something that Independent Sage was recommending 2 weeks ago, with the reduction in restrictions over the Christmas period, having a longer break to allow more isolation prior to that seems to be an absolute necessity if we're trying to control infection. So those are my main points. If those could be addressed, thank you.
I don't know how you're prepared to divvy that up, colleagues, presenters.
I'm happy to start, but I can only I think, as all of us, can only answer probably bits of that, really, Nigel, if that's okay. So from Ofsted's perspective, you don't know what you don't know. So actually, we know that the only thing we know about the spring term is that it's going to be really uncertain, and it's going to be impacted by a number of things that are out of people's control, certainly people's control within this room. The reason why we're not returning to full EIF or judged inspections where we grade schools is because we recognise that it because of the uncertainties and because of the upheavals that schools have faced, actually that's just a step too far for the spring term, which is why we've moved towards the monitoring visits. Now, the question could be raised as to why we're going in to undertake monitoring inspections. The point to that is that at some point we have to get back to something that reviews what children in very difficult circumstances are getting in terms of their education. So we know all schools are vulnerable during this period, as you've quite rightly said. But actually, we also know there are some schools that were judged to be inadequate or requires improvement, and have been that for a very long time because we haven't got back to them when we would normally do. So we have to do something that serves as a kind of interim between where we are now and getting back to full judged inspections. But I think the fact that we've returned to monitoring visits rather than full EIF actually symptomatic of the fact that we recognise no one really knows what the spring is going to bring. In terms of your question around the situation that schools are in, from the information that we've gleaned from the interim visits, what would be fair, I think, to say is that where schools are with remote education in the situation that we may need it, either for individual school bubbles or, you know, on a wider basis, I think that's very inconsistent, hit and miss. I'm not quite sure which better way to put it. I think schools are focused a lot on some of the practicalities of, have our staff got laptops, have our pupils got access to the internet, but actually then how you deliver a curriculum that way for any length of time, I think, is very tricky, particularly if you've got that kind of joint thing going on where you've still got some children at school and you've got some children at home. I think that's incredibly tricky for staff, actually, and for leaders. In terms of your commentary about where are we going in terms of the long-term assessment, I can't answer that one because I don't know is the answer. It's not something that's within our gift in terms of Ofsted. But that's kind of my bit. I don't know how helpful that is, Nigel. Helpful as mud, probably, or clear as mud.
That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, Kim, it's informed me, so thank you very much. Kate.
Yeah, I was just going to say I can certainly give you the position as far as the department's concerned on a couple of things, Nigel. So I think the idea of breaking up early is absolutely not on the table for us at all, because I think the view is, you know, that face-to-face teaching is the best we can offer to children, and whilst some people will do remote education well, we know that face-to-face is best. So there are no plans to close schools early for Christmas. And you asked about exams, and again, I have certainly picked up no sense at all that there will be a review of exams and sort of an abandonment of them, if you like, in the way that others might have done. And I think the Secretary of State, in all his communications, that is certainly his position. He wants exams to happen.
Can I come back in? I think the comment I would make to that is this just reflects the complete failure of the Department of Education in England. We knew that this was going to happen. We knew we were going to get a second wave. The complete failure to get schools prepared to offer a combination of face-to-face and remote learning is, I think, unforgivable. And for you now to be saying that you're not even thinking about very common sense steps that a lot of educationalists are pushing for and has been done already in Wales, and I believe Scotland is following suit. I mean, it's just, you know, are we burying our heads in the sand forever? When do we get through to the Secretary of State that he needs to actually think differently about this? Sorry, but I just despair.
Well, there was a question there, but I'm not sure any of our presentations cover that, or indeed any of our contributors can offer.
We do have one in the Department of Education, I believe. So there we go.
Does anybody want to come back to that, Kate? Is your partnership?
No, I mean, you know, I hear what Nigel is saying. I was simply sharing the Secretary of State's position.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Kate. I appreciate you.
Yeah, that's okay.
David, would it be possible just to? Oh.
Yeah, go on, Kim.
Sorry,
quickly.
Simon.
Simon.
No, Simon was next. Sorry.
Okay, Simon, away we go.
I mean, I was going to say that, you know, it's difficult to forecast what's going to happen locally. I do think it's going to be very difficult in terms of the number of infections. What we will be able to do is to further scale up our support compared with where we are at the moment. I mean, we've scaled up a lot since September. So we do envisage we'll be able to support schools with infection control and management and all their other challenges as we have to date. I think the question of remote learning is a particularly interesting one. I mean, we commissioned HFL to start developing support for schools in around May. So a lot of work has been undertaken by them and programs of support rolled out. I can't remember all the details, but I know that they are one of the largest, if not the largest, partner with Google in terms of the deployment of a technology called Google Classroom.
Yeah.
So if Nigel or colleagues wanted to know further about what we're doing in terms of remote learning and blended learning, then I can easily arrange for information or a presentation on that. So I don't think it's quite fair to say that we haven't tried to prepare schools for the challenges of teaching remotely. I think we have. There's more ground to be done. There's the rollout of technology, and I think Kate has referred to the scale of provision of devices, but it's a huge programme of provision of devices, but more are actually needed, and there is more to do. So anyway, should you want to know further more about that aspect of our activity, then very happy to provide it.
I think that would be really appreciated, Simon. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
I'm very aware that a lot of work is being done. And sorry if I overstepped the mark a little bit. I think the issue really is getting us a better understanding of how schools in Hertfordshire are able to adopt a different way of working. I think everybody had hoped we were going to be able to go back, particularly over the summer as rates came down, back to some sort of normality. That's clearly not been the case. And we need to know just how able we are, and it really comes back in my mind to the inequalities issue. Take totally on points that both Kate and Kim made about the fact that one of the real issues here is the difference of experience from one school to another, and making sure that with those pupils who tend to be in the poorer communities don't get left behind. I mean, I've got a primary school in my division that I couldn't even have a Teams or Zoom call with the assistant head because of the lack of IT capability.
Yeah, that is troubling. Okay, thank you very much for that. Now I've got Ron's been waiting patiently. I've also got Lynn. So Ron, would you please come in?
Thank you, David. My question is, I think probably more Simon, but also I think Kate has a part of it, and it's really an up-to-date version of part of what Nigel was saying. It's all over the news that the government are thinking of putting 7 London boroughs into Tier 3 on the 16th of this month. Our southern border districts have interaction between London boroughs and themselves in terms of workers, care home visitors, all sorts of passage backwards and forwards. There's no border at the M25, as it were. So I wonder whether or not anybody is actually taking note of what the government are thinking of doing in the London boroughs. Whether there was no details. So are any of the 7 London boroughs in the north of London? In which case, what is Hertfordshire doing about preparing possibly for an implication of effects on us, particularly, as I say, in the southern half of the county?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting set of questions, Ron. I'm not sure it's an educational set of questions. I mean, I know that.
Sorry, Simon, if I can just interrupt. It basically goes straight to the heart of your comment about the infection rate of 11 to 16s is going up, and that is what is driving the government towards this conclusion in those 7 boroughs. So it directly affects the rising infection rate in secondary schools. Sorry to interrupt you.
Well, I think there are multiple criteria which the government applies when it decides where in what tier to place authorities. And I know there's a considerable discussion taking place, certainly led within our public health service, about the likely future trajectory of infections locally and what that means for the tiering process. And I wouldn't want to comment on that myself because I'm not close enough to it to give a definitive public view. But I do think that there's a considerable risk, as you say, of a rising number of infections affecting school children. And we also know that those infections are not predominantly spread within schools. So it's not that the infection control and management system inside schools is breaking down. It's predominantly that the infections are being spread, if you like, outside of the school environment, and then they come into the schools. So what happens in the wider world does clearly very much impact on what happens in our schools. but we will respond to however the pandemic plays out.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for that interesting point of information, which I wasn't aware of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Ron. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you. You have sort of alluded to it. I think my question is more to Kim and to Simon, really. Apologies, Kate. But when we did one of our last scrutinies, one of the things that really came up was about digital poverty. And it's really become my sort of thing at the moment. And I wondered, Kim, I suppose I'm asking, when you've done some of your reviews, has that come to the fore in some of the Hertfordshire schools? And Simon, there was some notifications during the press and everything that the government had actually cut back on the number of PCs that schools were getting. And I wondered if that had impacted in Hertfordshire, so that we get the true figures and not what's in the press. So I think digital poverty is too important to just be alluded to. I'd like to actually have an answer on that. Thank you very much.
Simon, do you want to go first or shall I?
Well, if I talk about the numbers, and maybe you can deal with the poverty, Kim.
That's a big thing to deal with, Simon, but I'll have a good go, yes.
Actually, I think the numbers is also a matter for Kate. I mean, the way that the system's worked is that when schools are required to send home pupils or groups of pupils, then they will receive an allocation of devices to related to the number who may be disadvantaged and may not have access to technology, in order to help those pupils have remote learning. And there are various other allocations for critically extremely vulnerable pupils and so on. And the DfE operates, if you like, a kind of formulaic calculation as to how many devices to allocate. And the formula has changed over time. So at different times it's been more generous, and at other times it's been less generous. And I'm sure Kate can talk about that, but I think we believe that it's related to the availability of devices. And I know that for the County Council itself, at the moment, we're suffering from an inability to get hold of the number of laptops that we would like to procure, because of an absolute shortage in the national marketplace. So there's an absolute problem about being able to supply equipment. It's not just a policy or a financial decision. But I'd defer to both Kate and Kim in terms of the impacts and the national position.
Thanks, Simon. Kate, would you like to take up?
Yeah, I suppose, if Simon's experiencing a shortage, part of that reason is because the DfE have bought such an enormous amount of laptops and tablets. Lynn, I don't recognise that we have, decided in any way to reduce the number of laptops or tablets that we would give schools. We continue to, as Simon said, use the formula that we have, and where we hear of schools who say or local authorities who say they haven't got what they need, we certainly engage with them, and it's of course our absolute priority to make sure that children have access to that if they otherwise wouldn't. Of course, there was some delay, and that was, as I say, because of the sheer numbers. I mean, the amount that we have ordered has been an extraordinarily high, and so that in itself, of course, is going to cause some difficulty. But we have got so many out to so many children. It's made a significant difference.
Thank you. Is there anything, Kim, that you can add to this?
Yes, David, if that's okay. I've kind of got a couple of points, actually. It's probably quite long-winded, so bear with me, Lim. The first one for me is that I'm not in a position. I don't work for the local authority or the DfE, so I can't talk to you about actual numbers and Hertfordshire itself. What I can talk to you about is that from the evidence that we've gleaned, between the DfE, local authorities up and down the country, and schools themselves, they have worked non-stop to try and get the right provision remotely to as many children as they possibly can in very difficult circumstances. So I set that as my caveat before I move forwards. So we don't detract from that. But the problem is that actually remote learning is about a lot more than the dongle that you can get Wi-Fi for and the laptop. Because actually, if you're in the early years, a laptop is not going to be much use to you if you're 4 years old, necessarily. There are some brilliant 4-year-olds with laptops, but you know what I mean. It's not going to be much use to you. If you have particular special educational needs, actually sometimes the remote learning in your home is more disturbing to your sensory needs than actually it's helpful. So I think there's a whole series of things about actually you can give a family a laptop, but a lot of it will rely also on parents to be able to support children. And schools are having to cope with those situations as well. How do we help the parents? How do we make sure that they've got the right, a laptop might not be right for every situation. Remote learning is not always about it being digital. So I think there's a series of complexities that haven't been overcome yet. And actually they're incredibly difficult, which I think comes back to Nigel's original point. And I just wanted to just reiterate there. Look, I don't work for the DfE. I don't have any stall to set here. What I'm saying is that while I hear all of your points, Nigel, about children and early closure of schools and all those types of things, actually we also know that leaves some really vulnerable children incredibly vulnerable if we close schools. And we know that actually them going off for Christmas break sometimes for many children is a vulnerable time anyway. If we extend that period of time, I think there's increasing concerns. So if you couple that alongside Lynn's point about the challenges of remote learning, I think we end up in a situation where, taking all of Nigel's points on board, the preference is always to keep children in schools for as long as you possibly can for a variety of reasons. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Yes, thank you. If I could contribute there, I mean, it's one thing, and we've all been concerned about making the provision of the kit and, trying to get a signal into the property so that they can actually operate. But the environment, you can just imagine the environment that some of these young people are trying to work in. And it doesn't have the discipline and the formality and the support. And I can see situations where sometimes it's more harm than good, to be frank. But
sometimes, David, they don't have heat and food.
And light, heat, food, light.
So actually,
the kitten's better fed than they are. Yeah, exactly.
Can I just come back, David? I think
quickly, Lynn, yes, please.
Yeah, I think one of the terms is the fact digital poverty. I think we very much look at people, young children who are perhaps more vulnerable, but with more parents working at home, there are still a lot of families who cannot afford basically to have one laptop per person, because whereas it used to be a family share, they now actually, to be able to do the distance learning and to work from home, actually need one each. So perhaps I need to change the word digital poverty to digital access, and that can have a real impact on what the kids are learning. Thank you very much.
At this point, I'm going to look to John. John is one of our church representatives on Overview and Scrutiny, and he's posed a number of questions in chat, but I'm assuming, I'm not sure if he's able to put them himself. Are you there, John?
Hi, David. How are you doing?
Hello, John. Good morning. I think you had a couple of questions. From what I can see, they're geared towards Kim.
Well, the first one is Kim. I was just curious about. I absolutely understand about the softly approach to schools. I think that's absolutely right. But if an inspector gets or finds a concern when visiting a school, how would they actually deal with that if they're not able to make judgments at the moment?
And John, I should have said that at the time, shouldn't I? It's a really good question. I'm really sorry I didn't cover that earlier. Okay, so we still have the power, because the interim visits currently are under the Section 8 basis. We still have the power to convert those into, do you remember me talking about NFDs, no formal designation inspections?
Right. Yeah.
So if we went into a school yesterday and we had significant concerns about how they were safeguarding children, for example, we would be able to convert that inspection to then write a letter that then says as to whether safeguarding is effective or not effective. Now, what we've been subsequently putting in, we've only had a few of those, but what we've subsequently been putting into letters is that we will come back. Originally, we were saying on a Section 5, well, we're not doing those at the moment. So we have actually then come back on another Section 8 to check on those specific arrangements. So that's an example of how we would do it. So we wouldn't ignore significant concerns.
Okay, thank you. And I had a couple for Simon as well, if that's okay. So, so Simon, so as you know, I'm a chair of governance at a Hertfordshire school. And I'm hearing that many teachers are really feeling under quite a lot of strain at the moment. I'm just wondering how would the council, what mechanisms are you getting in place to get feedback on how teachers feel they're coping, and then also how they, how supported they are feeling from either yourselves or from HFL or from any other organisations?
Yeah, I mean, we have there's a number of different routes here. We have with HFL a wellbeing programme which deals with mental health and emotional wellbeing. That's directed towards staff and head teachers and senior staff, and that's a part of the HFL website, and it signposts schools to a range of different resources. But in terms of head teachers' personal emotional wellbeing and mental health, then they have the ability to talk to one of the lead HFL people who form part of that emotional wellbeing team. The second route for schools to get to get support, or leadership to get support, is through the HIP programme. So where schools have a Hertfordshire improvement partner, or they can go up the tree, if you like, to the district school effectiveness advisors, then that's a route to what you might call a listening ear for heads and leaders who've got serious concerns. If there are issues with individual members of staff and their concerns, then there's a route through the commissioned HFL HR service. We're also using some of the funding from the government's fund. I forgot what it's called. It's something like emotional support for education wellbeing return, or something like that. There's an allocation of around £200,000 to the authority, and that is to provide and equip schools with the skills to work with pupils suffering emotional wellbeing challenges on return. And we've rolled out a package of training to schools around how to do that. But an aspect of that programme relates to the support of teachers themselves with their own personal problems. So that's the spectrum of what we're doing. I mean, you also mentioned, John, in your chat, what you described as the brokerage visits, which I imagine won't be necessarily very clear to other members of the panel. What they are is that for maintained schools, we undertake through HFL one visit each year. So every school gets a single visit. Those visits have a degree of similarity to what Kim has described as the professional dialogue visits, which Ofsted have been undertaking in the autumn term. So they're about professional dialogues about early years, or about they can be about finance, they can be about governance, they can be about the attainment gap, they can be about a whole range of different safeguarding, a whole range of different issues, and they will be about recovery increasingly. What we want to do with our schools, what we're doing this year round, is we've asked schools to identify a time slot next term or the term after at a time that suits them, and I imagine most of them will go for the summer term, but by no means all. Some are keen for next term, to have those visits. and those will be part of the process through which we engage with our schools in planning how the recovery is going to take place. And I've talked about the kind of 6 themes earlier on, but these professional dialogue visits with schools are an important part of that. And I'm seeking to reassure schools that these are, rather like Kim and the Austin visits, these are not inspections. That's always been a bone of contention. This is a professional dialogue. It's supposed to be supportive. It's a route into other support. It's not judgmental, but it's an important part of our relationship with our schools community.
Thank you, Simon. Is that it, John? You?
Yeah, I think just you know, when I'm hearing that head teachers are, feel that maybe the timing, it's about timing, but are feeling under pressure, and perhaps the brokerage meetings was a bit like proposals, a bit like the maybe a final straw. I don't know, but certainly I'm hearing that there's some pressure there. It might be helpful if there are routes for head teachers to get support, Simon. It might be helpful to let governors, or at least chairs of governors, have some information about those routes, so that they can help in supporting their heads, or trying to support their heads. They can actually advise them accordingly. You mentioned that in terms of the routes that you mentioned are available. Is there any evidence that head teachers have been using those routes more than normal during the COVID crisis? Do you know?
That's not a question I've asked. I'd be surprised if the answer was. I'd be surprised. I would be surprised if they weren't using them more.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a hand there from Ron, but I think it might be a legacy. In the meantime, Nigel's seeking some clarification. Nigel, would you like to go ahead while we establish Ron is still there? Ron, can you take your hand down if you
Sorry,
I'll
take it down.
Thank you. Nigel, the floor's yours.
Yeah, thanks, and sorry to be back again. So the clarification I just wanted to make is actually what I'd said earlier. And I suppose it also leads into a question. I wasn't suggesting either or of schools being fully open or fully closed. What the Independent Sage was hearing 2 weeks ago were pleased that we developed, or more schools were able to develop, the sort of mix and match type education that I know parts of the independent sector have adopted, where you're basically limiting the amount of attendance. So you're basically shift systems, so that kids get some face-to-face, but it's not all face-to-face, so that you can you can be much more effective on your infection control in the school place. I mean, one of my schools in my division, the primary school, I mean, it was struggling with space already. It's been expanded. Simon will know the one. We finally got an extra dining room being built, which is really helpful. But, you're looking at a school that is 100 years old, was built for very, very much fewer pupils than it currently is educating, and being able to spread the load by being more imaginative, by being less dogmatic about whether we have everybody there or not, I think is something that I would hope that we're looking at and that schools are looking at. But I do find it depressing when I'm hearing sort of dogmatism particularly from the Secretary of State, that we must have exams and pupils must get face-to-face, because we have to try ways to limit the infection. And Simon, just coming back to your point about the infection happening, I mean, again, the evidence that I was hearing to Independent Sage was that there is, and also I've heard from Public Health, is that there is infection around schools. It may not be in the classroom because the actual spacing in the classroom is fine, but it's all the corridors, it's all the out at the school gate interactions. The very fact that you've got a cohort of young people in close proximity is not helpful to controlling the spread. And I mean, you just have to look at the graphs of infection rates compared to when schools went back and beyond. It's not rocket science. We've not succeeded here for whatever reason.
Nigel, sorry, you're off on a bit of a.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a point of clarification there?
The question is, are our schools looking at alternative ways so that they can effectively shift to a mixture of online and in school education?
Okay.
I-
Who's going to pitch
I mean,
into
I
that,
think
Simon?
my answer to that would be they are, but they're looking at it in the context of only doing online if, for various reasons, it's not possible to do face-to-face. It's very clear, the guidance from government, that if face-to-face is possible, then that is the government view as to what should happen. Now, of course, if you haven't got staff or children are self-isolating, or you have to send a bubble home, then of course it's not face-to-face. But where possible, the DfE expectation is that it's face-to-face, and that's something that we have reinforced to schools.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, at this point, I'm going to draw a close. I can see no other hands or gestures of wishing to. Fine, good. So it's my pleasure to thank Kim and to thank Kate and Simon for joining us this morning. Thank you so much. That's been really, really helpful. We have gone beyond the allotted time, but I don't think that time has been used badly. I think I consider myself wise to have let it run a little bit because we've learnt a lot. Thank you so much. If and when questions arise afterwards, because sometimes we do our better work on the way home, I do hope that if we've got any questions, we can, through our officers, ask for expansion and explanation. So thank you so much. Really, really. I know it's taken, because of your work programs, it's taken a while to get it into the diary, but we really do appreciate your being here. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, David.
Thank you very much.
No, it's a
Bye.
pleasure. Pleasure is
Bye.
entirely ours. So, colleagues, at this point, it's now 11:21. I'm going to call a short break until 11:30. So could Democratic Services switch off the live feed, please, and let me know. And we will now take a Once again, I hope I'm able to welcome you back to this meeting. Waiting confirmation that are now live streamed.
David, you haven't got the microphone near you.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, usual trick. We are now live again to the live stream. The public can see us. Once again, welcome back to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. We now go into the recommendation for item 2, which we will find on page 13 in the agenda pack, 3.1. The committee considers the information provided and identifies any implications for future work, which I believe we have more than adequately done. Can we have confirmation of that, please, from the membership in the usual way in the chat con? I'm just looking for a note from our Democratic Services colleagues that they've received that. Thank you. Lots of people noting it. Thank you very much. That has been agreed. Many thanks. So we'll move without any further ado on to item 3, integrated plan proposals 2021-22 to 2024-25. As you remember, we decided some while ago that we would look at the integrated plan with a view to a medium-term overview as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome Scott, and I think he'll be ably supported by Stephen on this occasion. Scott, good morning.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, okay, so firstly, thank you, councillors and also Scrutiny Committee members. This morning, I think is really the sort of the launch of our integrated plan sort of approval process for 21-22 through to 24-25. And really just to sort of highlight really the Herculean effort that's been undertaken by every sort of corner of the council, every department, and the councillors getting involved in starting to not only balance our budget for this year against obviously quite considerable pressures that I'll outline in a moment, but also being able to sort of now prepare for setting next year's budget and beyond. But as you can probably appreciate, everything is extremely fast moving. And things are very much changing as almost week to week. So what I plan to do this morning is just give you sort of an update on the national picture. So we'll start at a much more macro level because of the interdependencies with what's going on at a national level down to how it impacts on us all the way through to the residents that we serve. I'll then just give an apologies if I'm teaching some councillors and members of this committee to suck eggs, but I'll just do a few basics for those that may be new to this part of our to local government finance, and give some explanation just to how our budget works, the key mechanics on how it's all put together. I'll give you an update on where we are in 2021, i.e. the current year, how we're performing from a financial perspective. Then we'll get the crystal ball out and try and predict what 21-22 beyond is going to look like. And then finally, I'll put it all together in terms of my sort of recommendations and maybe sort of advice about where you start to sort of focus your attention and efforts as you start to roll into the scrutiny in anger in the new year. Because the IP pack, for any of those of you who have already seen it previously, will keep a door. It will be a door stop that won't allow your door to move for many years because it is so large. So we'll give you some focus about where that needs to, where you need to focus your attention. Okay, so next slide, please. So let's move on to the national picture. Next slide, please. So a couple of graphs here. Again, don't worry too much about the text. I'll give you some explanation about what this is all telling us. So at a national level, there we were as a country, bobbling along since, what's that, Q4 2010, with a good level of growth within the economy. So running at about sort of 5%. Quarter-on-quarter growth in relation to GDP. So things were looking good, economy in the main performing well. Then the pandemic hit, and as you can see there, we switched and into reverse gear almost within a quarter. And as you can see, just more recently, that started to reverse somewhat as the major lockdown 1 restrictions started to be released. But obviously, as new data comes through, we'll start to see that probably almost certainly pull back again. So, the big issues for us is that obviously, GDP is a measure of productivity and output as far as the country is concerned. If you're seeing negative growth in the economy, then that highly links with probably reductions in tax revenues because businesses and output is not at the same level. Therefore, there's less money available to the government. Therefore, there's less money for the public sector. So, it's this cascade effect that takes place. So, in terms of how quickly the economy will recover is obviously a big unknown, and the Chancellor has done his best to be able to try to predict that in his recent budget. But what we haven't seen with that drop in GDP, which in any normal sort of recessionary period or sort of a de-acceleration in the economy, you would see that there would tend to be sort of a similar match increase in unemployment. Well, because of the initiatives the government put in, primarily around the furlough scheme, but also business support and grant payments to businesses, and also the financial support the government has provided to public sector, we haven't seen that reduction in unemployment. The increase in unemployment as we would have expected. We're starting to see, as you can see there, that unemployment back in 2010 running along at 7.5%, but dropped down to around just under, what's that, about 4%, and slightly starting to peak up again this year. But we probably haven't yet seen the impact of this of unemployment levels now until the furlough schemes have been completely completed and we start to see the long-term effects on our economy. Next slide, please. So in terms of the national picture for local government, back from the previous credit crunch and the worldwide sort of contractions of economies back in 2009, 2010, there was quite considerable reductions in public sector expenditure. The government of the day made the clear decision that they were going to balance the country's books through reductions in public sector expenditure rather than effectively national taxation. And that really linked into us. We saw many negative. You just see the last year when it hit us in 2016-17, but with all the years before that, from about 2010, we were seeing quite considerable negative reductions in our support in the grants that we receive here in local government and here in Hertfordshire. We've seen more increases more recently in more recent years, as you can see there. But the one message to be able to say here is that all of these increases that we've had since 2017 have not been sufficient to offset the reductions that we lost from 2010. And what there's been is a switch from government funding more to increases in council tax. So it's almost like the local taxpayer has borne more of the burden to be able to address the financial challenges that we've faced within local government. Next slide, please. So what's the impact of COVID been on us, both nationally and also with us locally in Hertfordshire? So the latest projections that we have from government would show that in 2021 across the sector, there has been just over £11 billion worth of extra expenditure, which we haven't seen which again, which was all expenditure that wasn't expected within the budgets that we set back in February this year. And as far as Hertfordshire is concerned, what we've got there is £133 million of that 11.3 billion is ours. That was the pressures that we have incurred during the course of this year in addressing and responding to the pandemic, whether that is increase in infection control measures, whether it is supporting the care provider market, whether it is compensating losses within our music service because they've not been able to deliver music lessons in the traditional way. So lots of issues there. And as you can see the breakdown there of extra expenditure, additional income, and all the pressures adding up to 11.3 billion. Next slide, please. So then if we look at what that means for government debt. So the Chancellor stood up a week or so ago now and revised all of his predictions in relation to the public sector net borrowing requirement. And as you can see here, that borrowing was again was pretty stable, if not on a slight downward curve over recent years. But the latest forecast, which is that black dotted line, is showing quite a considerable increase, a very peak of a level that we've not really seen in many decades, and certainly outstrips the level of borrowing that we required during the latest austerity period that we would have remembered. So you can see there that quite considerable now level of borrowing that's going to be required, and obviously with the debt repayments that even though the government will obviously manage its debt in the way that it has in the past, and can obviously extend some of this over long periods of time, there will still be a level of debt repayments, and then we need to understand what that means: less money available to the wider public sector. Next slide, please. So that's the national position. So if I now sort of bring us down on what this could mean to us in Hertfordshire. So just a couple of sort of key basics as far as our budget is concerned that we have, and when you get into the scrutiny side of this, you'll be confronted with effectively two major parts of our expenditure. One is our day-to-day revenue expenditure, and the other side of it is the things that we do. We're spending money on improving Hertfordshire, whether it's building new assets, whether it is renewing places, whether it's upgrading things such as highways and roads, etc. And that comes out of our capital finances, and I'll explain how we fund both of those in a moment. But if I can just bring it down to how it is from your perspective, a day-to-day finances, your revenue expenditure is very much like that you go down the shops this evening, you'll go and buy some groceries, you'll fill your car up with petrol. That's your day-to-day revenue expenditure coming out your current account. But I need to buy a new car in a year's time. That's when I'm predicting I need to replace my car. I'm going to be putting money aside for that capital purchase in the future. So that's really the separation that we have here also at a council level. So in terms of how we're funded, the way that we fund revenue and capital is pretty different, and the implications are going to be different with probably the future financial constraints we're going to be under. 62% of our funding for revenue comes from our council tax. So if we start to see a reduction in the amount of council tax that we collect as an authority, or the district councils on our behalf, then that will have an impact on our day-to-day budget. And there are indications that we're seeing it varies from district to district, but we had plans in our IP in its early drafts that could see up to a 5% reduction in our council tax, and what you could start to see in terms of its collection. So the impact on our budget could be quite significant. And then as far as capital is concerned, half of our fund, the way that we fund our capital programme, is through borrowing. The other half is pretty much from grants and contributions. So that's money that comes in, whether it's from bidding into government pots or initiatives, and we're able to secure funding that way. But the other half is from us borrowing. And my concern with that is that I'm starting to feel that the levels of borrowing on our capital programme are reaching limits of which I'm just about comfortable with. I feel that we need to constrain capital expenditure to some degree as well over the medium term, and we need to try to shift more in terms of our asset strategy, in terms of disposing of assets that are surplus to requirements, to take more of a strain on our capital finances. Next slide, please. So bring it all together. This is what we spend. We spend £1.2 billion a year, and made up of just over £1 billion on revenue expenditure, and then just shy of 177 million on capital investment. You can see the main department areas there. That is adult social care, as you'd probably expect, is our largest spend department. And then from a capital perspective, our environment and infrastructure department is our largest capital spend area, again, as you'd probably expect. Next slide, please. So 2020-21, a financial year like no other, and certainly from I've been an accountant since I was 23. When I was all of those years and budgets that I've set over those years, I've never experienced a financial year quite like this year in trying to control a budget. Next slide, please. So for us, COVID funding, and this is again that no political comments from me about this, as you would expect, but the government, in relation to the early support and the signalling it gave to local government that it would underpin the COVID financial pressures as much as they could, was very welcome, and it allowed us to plan better in relation to the initiatives and our response that we needed to make to COVID. So we've over £62 million worth of funding has been announced in terms of general grants for us to be able, not ring fenced, other than applying them to the way that we're responding to COVID. They've also put in an income loss compensation scheme. So the example I gave was the music service. Part of that 7 million is responding to losses of income we've experienced there. We've incurred £73 million worth of additional costs. So when you add the two together, we've got a variance of about £4 million as we sit today. And obviously that situation is fast moving, but that will need to be met from the council's coffers effectively in being able to balance our budget this year. But it's certainly not the many millions of £62 million that we needed to pick up there. We've also received further ring-fence grants, again for infection control, supporting hospital discharges, and various other ring-fence grants to be able to also take some of the heat from the pressures we face for COVID. Looking at our pressures this year through the current financial year, we've used that money to underpin the care provider market, whether that was because of their staffing models, that they couldn't have care providers and workers moving around from care home to care home. So this allowed them to, so their staffing requirement went up. It was costs in relation to PPE. All of that side of stuff needed to be supported within the sector. Our trading companies, Hearts Catering Limited, obviously provides its core business is providing school meals, but with the significant school closures that we've experienced this year, they've obviously seen significant losses on their trading account, and they, in normal terms, we were expecting a sizable dividend that they return to the council every year, but obviously that won't occur this year. Music service I've already spoken about. Shield and Sustain. Another great example where within 2 weeks of the first lockdown, we needed to spin up a food distribution service for our Mundles operation down at Welland Garden City to be able to deliver food parcels, support with medication to the most vulnerable people within Hertfordshire. So there was costs, and we didn't charge for that food. That was all provided to those that were in most need. And okay, I won't go through all these, but even COVID compliance services, the way that we needed to adapt our libraries, our main council buildings, the registrar offices, to make sure that we can continue to be open as soon as we're able to, but keeping not only the public safe, but our staff safe as well, has all had a financial cost attached to it. Next slide, please. So how have we performed? If we now move COVID aside, just for one moment, let's have a quick look in terms of what the underlying day-to-day budget has looked like. And I'm pleased to report there that we have only experienced a pressure of £1.3 million. So from a chief finance officer, you know, so there's been some upsides from a pandemic, from a financial point of view, but our budget seems to be amazingly under control as a result of it. Obviously, you know, I'm only joking there, but from our point of view is that what you can see there is the red dotted line is tracked very close to the zero line, and that is the variation away from the budget that we set. So if our budget tracked along that x-axis over all the 4 quarters, we would have hit the budget bang on. But what you can see in previous years is that there's been quite a sizable variance from the budget, particularly last year, where we saw a very quick move away from budget, and it stayed away from budget for the whole of the year. I'm quite confident in terms of the variance that we see at the moment and the normal trends that we start to see in the second half of the year, that we should be able to bring our budget in balance this year. And that means that we've not, unlike many other authorities in the country, have needed to call an emergency budget. Next slide, please. So let's get the crystal ball out now and try and see if we can forecast what the coming years are going to look like. So this slide is our graph of doom. I think you've seen this in previous years, and what this effectively says is if I put my feet up now for the next 4 years, 2 things are going to happen to the budget. That costs are going to rise and income may well shrink or not keep pace with that expenditure. So what we're seeing here is that the service provision forecast, so effectively the inflationary aspects of the work that we do, we're expecting will go up by £175 million over the next 4 years. From a resources point of view, so assumptions around council tax and income that we receive, we believe during that period that will only go up by £83 million. So what we've already done is identified £46 million worth of savings already in the IP. They're not delivered as yet. There's still a lot of work to do, and I would say that this year we've fallen behind because, quite rightly, the organisation has been responding to the pandemic. We've also got £16 million worth of savings highlighted for what we call cross-cutting transformation programmes, and they're programmes that in terms of the way we work as a whole organisation and savings that we're looking to achieve. So we have a gap of £30 million that we need to address over this period. Next slide, please. So let me try and give some good news in terms of some highlights that we've had from this year. And it is difficult, you know, that because my job is to make sure that the budget is kept in check, but we do need to step back and really highlight what the budget is achieving. You know, at the end of the day, that £1.2 billion of expenditure are delivering things for the people of Hertfordshire. And I've just listed them here. I won't read them all the way through, but you know, in terms of such many millions of pounds injected into the care sector in providing the support for the workforce. You know, the money being put in place to support our most vulnerable children and those that are within our care. Additional funding going into the Hertfordshire local road network, and also more recently, following the full council's decision to declare a climate emergency, that we've put in capital funding to really get that programme underway, and I would expect to see more of those commitments coming through in the budget for next year as well. So we're in the home straight now. So as far as IP structure and approach to scrutiny, just to give you a few highlights here. Next slide, please. So this pack that's going to be able to wedge your door open over the Christmas period. These are the sections. It's made up from A to G. They're the key sections that really bring together the strategic elements of each department, where they're heading as a department. Our capital strategy, our investment strategy, some risk and insurance. So how do we sort of what sort of balance of risk do we believe that we're facing as a budget? Some considerations in relation to the qualities impacts of the decisions that we're taking, and then a whole range of technical tables. So really what this slide, which I understand was circulated to you yesterday, if not today, really just keep an eye on this one because it highlights the areas that we would propose that you focus on. So certainly Section A, certainly Section B in relation to the portfolio area that you've volunteered to take part on the scrutiny. Again, you may wish to read some of the others because there are interdependencies, but certainly concentrate on your area. And again, the capital strategy, again, I would certainly for the portfolio area that you're going to be scrutinising, I would probably suggest that you look at those areas as well. And then tips for scrutiny, it's not no one has any expectations that you need to understand that whole pack that will be before you. That our job as officers is to make sure that you understand the strategic context and issues that we face. Today's presentation is part of that, but we will do more as we go through the process. We have provided this year some opposition group spokes for resources, some dedicated sessions to get a little bit more underneath the skin of the budget, and that is taking place over the next few weeks. And we're also going to be introducing an extra challenge session following feedback from councillors in relation to a challenge for the budget as a whole at a real macro level. So start challenging inflation assumptions. Let's start challenging about pay award and assumptions, all of those sort of issues that have a real big impact on the wider budget, but you probably don't get a chance to really scrutinise at a departmental level. Sorry, just quickly back on that last slide, sorry, Natalie, is just the common sense challenge. Don't be afraid. There are no silly questions in budget. And just over the years, just to give you some feel, is that in budget challenges that I've been involved in, the new councillor or the new member that walks in and asks those questions that you all forgot to ask, because it feels like it's such a straightforward question, but it really does sometimes get underneath the fundamentals. Why are we doing something? Why are we spending £4.2 million on this particular initiative? And those questions are just as relevant as the question about the angle of the inverse yield curve on our treasury management strategy. So possible scrutiny questions, we've outlined them here for you. Questions you might want to ask about our savings programs and the likely impact of those savings. The other big factor for this year is around pressures and the way that departments have actually spent, rather than because they've not been able to drive savings programs forward as fast this year. It's the way they've been able to offset pressures and keep the pressures on our budget down this year. That's been a particular success across the departments. I think we're there. So back to you, Chair. And if I could just introduce Stephen Pillsworth, my AD for Finance, is also with us today. And if any difficult questions, absolutely, he'd be the man to answer. Thank you.
The art of delegation from the master. Thanks, Scott. That's a very that's actually a very relevant, pertinent canter through. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. We did have a question. I believe that Nigel asked a question around capital, which Stephen has dealt with in chat. I can't find it right now, but you're back in the race, Nigel. Your hand's up. Do you agree that you've been? The first question was answered, so presumably you're going to go to the second. Away you go.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, it was answered, but I rather confirms my suspicion that the figures are a little bit misleading in my view when we're looking at comparisons both in, sorry, I'm just going to try and find the right slides to refer to. Yeah, so we're looking at slide 4 and 5. Unless these are normalized per capita, it's a little bit difficult to really understand the significance, because obviously population is growing, and yes, in slide 5, the number of people under shire, districts, counties, etc., is not consistent. So running a comparison between them, what does it mean? It's very hard to judge. That's just a comment. And the other comment I was going to make on which I think you've already made, really, Scott, in the presentation. I mean, the move from central government grants to council tax funding for our main source of income is deeply regressive in terms of the tax base. Obviously, I suppose it's a past political point, but I'm sure that most on the left of the of politics would argue this is entirely wrong. But it's a given at the moment, unfortunately. My questions are more on the assumptions, and I only saw the announcement of the extra scrutiny. I very much welcome that, Scott, on the bigger picture budget. I think that's a really good idea. The things I found difficult in the paper to get my head round, there are a couple of government support items, 7.2 and also the sort of bucket one, I guess, in 7. Sorry, I'm losing my place. Sorry, 6.3 and 7.2. So 7.2 is the big picture graph. If I can find it again. And you mentioned, Scott, that at the beginning of this, the government were very good in offering support, which allowed us to spend, which is great. But the implication from table 7.2, as I read it, is we've got a revised gap post the impact of COVID that is 37.7 in total, because we've gone from negative 1.1 to plus 36.6. And yet we're assuming we're only get another 16.6 from government to actually fund that gap. So I guess the question is, well, shouldn't the government be funding the whole gap? And then the other question in 6.3 is there's a reference to the sales fees and charges compensation scheme, something I'm afraid I hadn't heard of previously. And it says that the council can reclaim 7 million against that scheme, but is that assumption included in the projections or not?
Yeah. Okay. Stephen, do you want to pick up those?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Nigel. If I pick up the first element of that, referring to section 6.3 of the report, so that section very much focuses on the current financial year, the costs and level of grant that we're getting in the current year. So I think you may recall from Scott's presentation, we are currently forecasting that this year COVID will cost the council somewhere in excess of £130 million. At the moment, pretty much all of that cost is going to be covered by the grants from government and contributions from partners, including CCGs around adult social care. In the case, just very specifically, part of that £130 million is the sales fees and charges money. That is only a proportion of the level of income we think we'll lose for that area. But of course, nonetheless, it's welcome and it's part of that wider package. What we've then looked to do, and this is where we get into section 7 of the report, these are very high level forecasts for next year. And to some extent, those are the forecasts that actually we were drawing together probably over the summer and we've refined a bit during the early autumn. What we'll now need to do is replace our assumptions in there about the level of government support we might get with some of the information that's come out from the spending review a couple of weeks ago. There were some high level, some countrywide numbers in terms of how much grant support government will provide to councils next year. What we're now looking to find out is how much of that will come into Hertfordshire, and hopefully we normally late December, just before Christmas, get the specific local government finance settlement. We're hoping through that we will know exactly how much is being allocated to Hertfordshire, and hence are we getting more, less than that £17 million assumption we had in there. And clearly, we will then look to factor that exact position into the IP proposals that will be released early January.
Thanks very much for that, Scott. So that, can I ask what that 16.6 is based on? I mean, is it a finger in the air or is it a bit more?
I would like to say there's years of experience behind that, but yeah, it was kind of finger in the air. Perhaps a bit linked to in the spending review last year that we got announced in September, there was an additional £1 billion nationally for social care, of which Hertfordshire received just under £15 million. So it was perhaps thinking we might get, well, obviously a continuation of that, but another £1 billion on top. So yeah, it wasn't terribly scientific. Okay. I have to say it was linked to that, and partly to some extent the size of that gap and possible forecasts of where we might be on council tax income. So yeah, an experienced finger in the air, I think, is probably how I would describe that. That
payment last year, that was one of these 1 year only payments, wasn't it, rather than a going forward one?
Indeed, it's one of the issues that is a challenge in the budget, that there are a number of grants in there that tend to get announced and reconfirmed 1 year at a time.
Yeah.
So that £1 billion, for example, was announced last year. It was in the Conservative manifesto that it would continue, so we had some level of confidence, but until you get that absolute final clarification of yes, it's continuing, this is the amount we're paying you on this date, then I'm always a little bit nervous.
So was getting a deal and not breaking the law, but there you go.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. I've got Ron, followed by Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of clarifications, and then I've got another point. First of all, Scott, thank you. On Appendix A, I note we have got the column on the left-hand side, which shows the current year, which enables us to look at the context going across. That didn't appear in all the accounts in last year's pack, which I criticised at the time. Adult Care Services did, but there were a number of other departments that didn't have that left-hand column. It does help when you're trying to compare the next year with this year and all sorts of things. So if we could keep an eye on that. Secondly, the impact of the government structured support on income lost on commercial property. They made a reduction because they're not happy with the amount of commercial investment into shopping centres and that some council have done. I know we haven't, but are we caught by that problem? I know my own borough, Decorum, has got caught by it, although perfectly innocently, and I just wondered if we had and what the effect of that is.
Okay, I'll let Stephen fill in maybe some of the detail, but certainly at a strategic level that we are working with Hearts Living. They've undertaken, they have a commercial investment portfolio that we established, and members agreed effectively a sum of money. It was around the 100 million mark for investments in commercial property. We undertook one investment down in Waltham Cross. And that all followed due process and is, I'm pleased to report is performing well, and rents are coming in as expected, and the debt repayments being made by HLL to us. So that being the case is, but with the changes in PWLB borrowing, they put a consultation out that you quite rightly outlined, Councillor Tyndall, that there is changes that the government is looking to restrict this sort of activity by councils that have gone a lot further than us, and as a result of that, looking to make a number of changes. So we have I put an immediate stop to all future investment. That fund effectively is now on pause until the government is clear about its following the consultation, clear about its position regarding future PWLB borrowing, and then we will review the situation at that point. But as it stands today, we're okay. We've made one investment, it's performing well, but no other investments will take place out of the money that you as councillors have approved.
Thank you very much, Scott. And then finally, my other question is, given the impact on manufacturing and industry general, and particularly we've got a strong pharma industry in the county, there's nothing on Brexit in the whole of this paper. Are you holding your fire until after the 1st of January, or i.e. is Stephen's finger not working for Brexit, and that because the wind's blowing in all 4 directions and in all different directions, it's virtually impossible to tell by Stephen's finger what the hell's going to happen.
Stephen is very keen to jump in at that point. So
I will respond to that, but also maybe just one additional comment on the commercial income point, because Scott is right, and Ron, you're right in the question. The government has said they will not cover any loss of commercial income through the sales fees and charges reimbursement, and this is off the back of, as we said, them being concerned about councils like Spelthorne Borough Council in Surrey that's borrowed £1 billion to buy property and wanting to put a stop to that. I do know there are districts within Hertfordshire who have been, I think, perhaps unfairly caught by that, because they've got some commercial property and premises that they've had for decades, almost go back almost to the inception of those councils, and they have had difficulty getting reimbursed for those losses, even though they're nothing to do with this more recent property spree that some other councils have done. So I know that has been a particular issue for some of our district councils, and you mentioned decorum. In terms of Brexit, you're right. There's actually, in terms of our budget thinking for next year and forecasts, very little we have in specifically for it. And it's one of the issues we sort of questioned quite strongly, because some of you may have seen some of the headlines that came out of the government's reasonable worst case scenario report that leaked, call it what you will, recently, and there were some items in there about potential council failure as a result. But I think, having looked at some of the narrative behind that, I think that was slightly more about, if you like, some of the existing weaknesses financially in many councils up and down the country after the period of austerity, after the COVID impact, perhaps rather than any really specific direct impacts. So we've had a look at that and think, well, where could the impact be, particularly if there is no trade deal arrangements? Well, actually, hopefully that might be more minor for the council. A lot of our issues and service delivery rely on people rather than goods and products. And to some extent, we have seen the impact of that already. So particularly in the care sector, some of the workforce we got from the EU, we've started to see, or have seen, a drift of that away ever since the referendum, partly off the back of what's been happening to the currency and the return they can get. So as a council, we've had to adapt to that over that period. And Scott had the slide up earlier about the investment in the current year in the care workforce and wages. In some respects, part of that is in response to a range of issues, including that. I think we do need to keep an eye on costs, so what might happen to energy prices, input prices in some areas, but hopefully that's at the slightly more minor end of our expenditure. You did mention about the possible impact on pharma and other companies. So, of course, one of the things we are keeping an eye on and have looked to factor in is the impact on businesses and business rate income for the councils. But I think to some extent at the moment, that's probably more affected by COVID and the impact COVID's having on a range of sectors, and hence business rate income, maybe rather than Brexit itself at the moment. So we are forecasting next year some reduction in business rate income, but more from a multitude of sources rather than just Brexit directly.
Thanks, Stephen. I was particularly impressed by someone, a lorry owner this morning, who said that he's reducing his fleet from over 60 vehicles down to 4 because he's not going to handle the weights at both ends of the channel crossing, and he's fed up, and he's just going to downsize his business just to deal with Britain. And I think that's an impact where that company is. That's a business rate hit, obviously. But I just wondered that, given the imposition of tariffs on the 1st of January, whether or not you're your proverbial finger had thought about a 2 or 3 or 5% increase overall, just as a perhaps a providential reserve, just in case.
I mean, it's important to mention reserve because to some extent, of course, we across the budget try and assess all risk. So not just arising from Brexit, but the ongoing impact of COVID and what could be the range of other issues, and hence what is a reasonable level of contingency and reserve to cover that. Now, inevitably, there's quite an amount of uncertainty about such forecasts, but yeah, I think we'll probably be raising Brexit as one of those that we do need to be thinking of in that overarching assessment.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
I'd hope to avoid the B word today, Ron, but you're right to raise it. Scott, anything to add?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. In that case, I'm going to go to Jonathan.
Thanks very much. On the basis that there are no silly questions, and I'm sure this is one that's been answered many times before, but I just need reminding. Capital budget and revenue budget, can you take some from one and put it into the other, or are they ring-fenced? And if that is the case, is that done internally within Hertfordshire, or do government stipulate you can't move one from the other? Perhaps you can just explain a bit more about that. Thank you.
The general rule that I advise all our officers that come knocking on the door with very similar question is that revenue expenditure can support capital expenditure, either sort of directly, just making a contribution in, or through supporting borrowing. But capital can't be used for day-to-day purposes. There are some very few exceptions to that, but in the main, you can't use capital to fund day-to-day revenue expenditure.
Okay, thank you.
And you're absolutely right, Jonathan. And the only silly question is the one that doesn't get asked. So yeah, no, good. Nigel, I see your hand again. You're more than welcome back, but I'm going to look to try and draw this to a close now. So
I'll be brief, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, so 2 very short points, 8.11 and 9.5. So 8.11 first mentions that 6 authorities are going to benefit from discounted lending for local infrastructure priorities. Did we apply? Were we unsuccessful? Any further information on that? And 9.5, Scott, you'll probably recognise where I'm going on this one. On the insurance side, we had a bit of correspondence a month or 3 back.
Yep.
Which then went to the Highways panel. I didn't really get a very good answer from Highways. From what you're saying in here, it looks like Highways ought to be able to get the money that I was asking for from this reserve. I'm a bit confused as to why they haven't, but maybe that's something we can take offline. I just wanted to flag that again. It's still an outstanding issue.
Okay. Stephen, are you able to pick up the 8 point? I'm trying to find 8.11.
Yeah. So this is the reference to the Public Works Loan Board, and in the same way we mentioned earlier about controls government is placing on that, at the time they did so, they increased the interest rate.
Oh yes.
Now they've confirmed the controls in place and concluded the consultation. They've lowered that back down for all councils, and we benefit from that. There is then a much smaller additional reduction you can gain for certain types of infrastructure projects. Off the top of my head, I don't know who those 6 are, but at the moment, my understanding is we don't have anything in our capital programme that meets that definition of infrastructure projects. So as a result, we are unable to apply for that. But happy to do a bit more digging around that and see if I can get any more information on those 6 and what sorts of things they are delivering that enables them to do so.
It would be nice if that was linked to climate, wouldn't it? Because I'm sure.
Could you pass that to officers just for circulation more widely within the committee, please, Stephen, when you do that? Thank you. I'm looking. I can see no more there. So if I may, I'll invite members to go to page 16 in the pack, where we're invited at 3.1 to note this report. Whilst you're agreeing or otherwise to that, I'm going to thank Scott and Stephen for their input. Valuable, well, invaluable as ever, and we look forward to your input into further input into the IP process. So many thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And while we're waiting for that to come in and final confirmation that that's been accepted, I'll walk us into item 4, if we may, where Fiona's going to talk to us around the scrutiny work programme. So just a few moments. Let's just get this formally acknowledged. It's looking good. Yeah, we're good to go. Fiona, thank you. Good morning.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. So you've got the work programme item in front of you. I just want to, there's a couple of things I just want to highlight because they're probably the things that you might have questions about or that you need to definitely be aware of. So in the in terms of scoping documents, you've got 2 new scoping documents to consider and to vote on at the end of this item. So one is the care delivery scrutiny topic group. I know there's been a lot of discussion and keenness to get going on this item from this committee. So you've got the scope there to consider now and discuss when the chair opens up the sort of the debate. And the other one is the hate crime scrutiny topic group, and I think it's just worth reminding a bit of background about that. Over a year ago, the committee agreed a hate crime scrutiny topic group because there is a statutory requirement to do a crime and disorder scrutiny every year, so it was going to be that one. But then, obviously due to COVID, original dates kind of fell by the wayside, and then when when you as a committee refreshed your work programme, that wasn't the top of the priorities for these few months because it was all the COVID impact things relating to children's services and education and adult care services. So it kind of dropped off the work programme, but not completely, because we obviously were keeping it. We knew we need to do something annually. So we've come to look at it again, and we've discussed with officers, and there've been discussions with the chair and vice chair of the committee. And so it's a refreshed topic group because the one that was agreed last year was focused on disability hate crime. And we're still, while it's on, you as a committee all understand that's still very important and won't be lost. What has happened in the last sort of over the last year or few months is, and officers have reported to us, is that there has been a peak in a spike in numbers of race and religious hate crimes reported in the county, and so it was recommended that this would be very, very useful for scrutiny to look at soon, and so that's the reason, because it is a very current, live issue, and outcomes of that will be particularly valuable now, kind of thing. So we want to look at that, the scoping document is there for you to agree, and something to consider would be that the disability hate crime scrutiny could be the focus for the crime and disorder scrutiny next year. So it certainly, the work done around that does not need to be lost. The other thing is we're trying to squeeze as much as we can. We know there's lots of things you want to look at, and we're trying to find ways of fitting it into the programme. So what we are proposing is that the hate crime scrutiny topic group takes place as a kind of embedded topic group within the whole committee. And that it takes place on the 28th of January, which is the afternoon of the day 2 of the budget scrutiny process. And this is a kind of method that the Health Scrutiny Committee have used quite a number of times, and it's been successful. So it's like a topic group, but over just an afternoon, and the whole committee are in the membership. But within the committee, there would be a sort of topic group chair and key members, like 5 members, like a topic group, who would be selected to particularly focus on it. So while other members would still be welcome to comment and question, there'll be particular members who are kind of designated as leading on it. And those members would be people who are not chairing IP groups, because obviously they've got you know, they're going to have enough, you know, just workload wise, it's just about trying to share that load. So that's the proposal there. Just to say that the Impact of Scrutiny Advisory Committee had met since this committee last met, and the minutes were not available when the papers were published, but we do luckily have the chairman of Isaac on this committee who might want to give a brief verbal update to you now. And the other thing to mention is around, sorry, I'm just looking through my papers here. Yeah, the other thing to mention is around the seminars. So we've got the Drug and Alcohol Services Scrutiny Seminar, which is in the work programme with not much specific information. But in the meantime, I've been working with officers, and that's all that's really coming together, and it will definitely include impacts of COVID on drug and alcohol services and treatments, and people's how that's affected people and their mental health and behaviours, which I know is something that the committee have brought up in the past and would like to know about. And that's going to be a webinar in early March, and so I think we'll be able to give you a date before Christmas of that one. And I think that covers all of the things I wanted to highlight, so thank you.
Fiona, thank you very much. A comprehensive gallop through that as usual. Thank you for that. That's helpful. Ian, no pressure, but are you in a position to give us a few thoughts around the work that you and your committee have been doing?
Yes, certainly, David. We had a meeting on the 11th of November. There were 4 items that we discussed. 3 of those were actually referrals back from a previous ISAC meeting where the committee wasn't satisfied and didn't have the reassurance that it was seeking that the action points had been dealt with properly. Those came back to the committee on the 11th of November, and that was the Local Resilience Forum, the Dementia Services topic group, and the Contract Market Volatility topic group. And on the 11th of November, the committee satisfied itself that those action points now had been satisfactorily completed, and they were reassured about that. There was one other additional item, which is a suicide prevention strategy topic group, which came for the first time to the ISAC committee on the 11th of November. And there were a number of action points there, which we had a very fulsome report on, and the committee was reassured that all of those action points could be signed off. So there are no longer any outstanding action points for ISAC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and may I record officially my thanks for the work that your committee does. It's very much in the background, but it's no less vital, and it's a massive contribution to the work that Overview and Scrutiny at Hertfordshire does, and we thank you and your members for that. I've got Ron and Nigel in that order. Ron, it may be useful for you to know we have Chris Badger in attendance, because I rather suspect that you might be wanting to be thinking about the care element of this.
No, I'm perfectly happy, because I'm never perfectly happy. That'd be totally wrong and misleading, but I'm content that, having read through it, the heading appeared to be slightly confusing, but then when I looked at the substance and the key lines of inquiry, that tended to cover all that I felt was useful. So I think that covers it. What I'm interested in is Appendix 2B, the hate crime, and particularly the second page, which is on page 52 of the pack, and an addition possibly to line 3, key lines of inquiry, because I think language and comprehension can be a major disadvantage and a barrier to getting through and talking to minority communities, and there's no mention of language and anywhere on that. And I just wondered whether or not we could add just a little phrase where it says, how does the partnership engage with marginalised groups to understand blah blah blah, including language or including transmission of advice or offers of assistance or something like that. So you get the point. It's just that it probably needs a complete looking at the whole form, and it could be popped in somewhere else, but so that we actually do question are we producing leaflets in lots of different languages? Are we actually getting through to our marginalised? Do the people that need our help actually understand we're here in the first place to help them? I think that's the key, and I think language is a key part of it. Thanks, David.
I rather suspect you're right, Ron. And when you talk about language, I think you're meaning it in the simplest sense. You're not talking about the professional language. You're talking about simply be able to communicate at a reasonable functional level.
For instance, in Decorum, we have a growing Romanian community. Now, potentially there is an argument for saying we should have a leaflet in Romanian saying the council is here to help you.
Yep, perfectly content with that. We've got officers here with us. I look to either of them to comment on that. Is that something that could be incorporated at 3?
My take on that is that that's the kind of question, when we were talking about the IP, asking those simple questions, I would have anticipated that would have been a question that a member of the topic group would have been asking the partners attending the scrutiny itself, is just to make sure that in supporting marginalised groups and communities, that actually you're approaching them in the most appropriate way, because we know that not only is language an issue in approaching certain groups, there are cultural barriers as well that we need to be cognizant of to address. So I think it's a really good question. I would hope that is raised as part of that scrutiny. And my understanding is that is covered in that final key line of inquiry.
I think so, Ron. I do agree with you, though. And when it comes to it, that address barriers, we must make sure that communication in all its forms, whether it be verbal or otherwise, is brought to the fore. Challenges around communication.
Yes, very quickly, and thank you, Natalie. I think Natalie very usefully tends to look at possible questions that the members of the topic group can ask, and perhaps that could be noted that would be one of the questions that's set down when Natalie does her very useful advice.
Noted.
Absolutely. Yep. Communication in all its forms. Okay. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Thank you, David. I was also going to ask about the title or the objective in the Appendix 2A, as we discussed last week. I did feel it ought to refer more closely to care homes because that was the main driver for the scrutiny. But as Ron says, the content is fine and the lines of inquiry fully support, etc., etc. So that's fine. On the second work program scoping document for the hate crime, as you'll recall last week, I was asked to approach Sandy Walkington to see if he would be happy to chair that. He's come back and said yes, but he also had some comments on the scope which I'd like to put forward, and that's really the makeup of the witnesses. Sandy quite rightly pointed out that there is nobody there really representing the views of the communities that are affected, either religious or racial, and maybe we could be thinking about finding ways to get somebody who can speak with that possibly lived experience of the issue. There are plenty of people both in the Jewish and the Islamic communities that one could approach. Or even and on the racial side, maybe even the BAME group, county group, would be willing to participate.
I can see a number of challenges around that, but we're not. We don't change course because of challenges. We take them head on. So I think officers have picked up on that. I'm not sure that we can get a reasoned and rational reply today.
David, I can respond to that.
Please do.
I would say that as usual, the section around evidence and witnesses is something that we continue to work on. What we're hoping the committee will be able to do is to agree the key lines of inquiry, basically, so that officers can then start working with the core witnesses to make sure it's deliverable. As with any piece of scrutiny, we would be looking for representatives of groups to attend that scrutiny to give that lived experience, and it's something that we've already talked to the lead officer about, and we've given some thought around how to make that meaningful and which groups would be the ones that could confidently speak, because again, going back to the earlier comments around some of the issues for some of the more marginalised groups, is that this is not going to necessarily be a really comfortable environment for them, so that we'd be looking for ways of getting their evidence in, which could be a representative of that community, or that they are more willing to provide a short written submission that members can then have a look through and then raise any questions with the witnesses. But just to give assurance to the committee, as is usual practice, and to anybody externally watching in on this, views of the community are hugely important and hugely valued by members when they're undertaking scrutiny, and that is something that we will endeavour to continue to provide for any scrutiny, and this being a case in point.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's I can see anybody that's been a victim of any kind of issue around this would naturally have reservations, but if officers can investigate effective methods of doing it in a way that doesn't put people under undue pressure, that would be fantastic. Natalie, can you keep myself and the Vice Chairman informed of that process as it develops?
Very, very happy to.
Thank you very much. I'm looking now. All I can see from the committee. Any other comments on this part of the proceedings on item 4 from members of the committee?
I think Margaret has a hand raised, David.
Yes, but she's not a member of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, Nigel. So at this
sorry, my mistake.
Yeah, at this stage, I'd like to keep the proceedings fairly taut. But looking across, any other members? Wants clarification questions? No. In that case, can I invite you to accept the recommendations? They are coming in. Thank you. Excellent. That looks, I'm just waiting for confirmation. That all looks very good. Thank you. Excellent. All right. So with agreement with that, thank you very much. There is no other part 1 business, but item 7 is items to report to the council, which you have seen. And again, can I ask you to agree?
Sorry, David, I'm unclear what we're being asked to agree.
Item 7, items to report to the County Council. The items for inclusion in the committee's report to the County Council.
Where is that on the agenda?
Oh, sorry, no, it's not. It's not item 7. It's item 6. It's from my my crib, so I apologise. Yeah, you're right. So we move on then to dates of the next meeting. Which we'll all note, and that is the formal end of the meeting. But in so doing, I really would like, although they're not with us now, I really would like to express my thanks to Kim and Kate. It has been difficult to arrange a time. We would have liked to have seen them before now, but it's been very difficult. As you can appreciate, they're under a lot of time pressure with their primary role, but it was very good to hear from them, and thanks to that. And you know, we also heard some very good stuff from Simon, and thanks to him. Scott and Steve and I've already thanked. Chris was sitting there in the background ready to help us if we needed it, with particular reference to care. And it would be remiss of me not to mention Debbie and Ellie from Democratic Services, who have been sitting patiently and quietly in the background, but working really, really hard. And finally, my thanks to Natalie and Fiona, who have made all this possible. And I can't emphasize how hard they have to work to get these witnesses in front of us. So my many thanks for that. And then finally, just thank you, the members of the committee, for your application. It's a joy to work with you, a challenge, but a joy. And also to those other members of the council that have turned up today. Many thanks. So that's the close of the meeting at 12:39. Many thanks.